The snow crunched beneath Captain Alexander Hamilton's boots as he surveyed the ragged Continental Army encamped along the banks of the Delaware River on December 30th. The young artillery officer pulled his threadbare coat tighter against the bitter wind, his breath forming ghostly clouds in the frigid air. Round him, men who had once marched with pride now huddled around sputtering fires, their faces gaunt with hunger and defeat. General George Washington stood silently at the river's edge, his imposing figure casting a long shadow across the ice-crusted water. The commander-in-chief's weathered face bore the weight of a revolution that seemed destined to fail. Behind him, the remnants of what had once been a proud army of liberation now resembled little more than a band of desperate refugees. Barefoot, soldiers left bloody prints in the snow, their uniforms reduced to rags, their muskets rusted from months of retreat. The statistics were devastating. From the summer's peak of over 20,000 men, Washington's force had dwindled to fewer than 3,000 effective soldiers. Enlistments were set to expire at midnight on December 31st, and most men had already made clear their intention to return home. The cause of American independence, which had burned so brightly just months earlier with the signing of the Declaration of Independence, now flickered like a candle in a hurricane. Across the Delaware, British and Hessian forces occupied Trenton, their warm quarters and full bellies a stark contrast to the American suffering. Lieutenant Colonel Johann Rall, commanding the Hessian garrison, had grown complacent in his comfortable position. His soldiers, professional warriors from the Germanic states, considered the war all but won. They celebrated the approaching new year with the confidence of victors, dismissing the ragged Americans as a spent force incapable of meaningful resistance. Washington's military advisor, General Nathanael Greene, approached through the swirling snow. "The men are at their breaking point, sir," Greene reported quietly, his voice barely audible above the wind. "Many speak openly of abandoning the cause. They say the dream of independence died with our retreat from New York." The commander-in-chief nodded grimly, understanding the weight of Greene's words. The defeats at Long Island, White Plains, and Fort Washington had shattered American morale. British General William Howe's forces controlled New York City and much of New Jersey, while American supporters fled or switched sides daily. European observers dismissed the rebellion as a brief uprising destined for the history books. Yet something stirred within Washington's heart as he gazed across the icy Delaware. Perhaps it was desperation, or perhaps it was the divine providence he so often invoked in his prayers. The general had carried Thomas Paine's words with him through every retreat. These are the times that try men's souls. Now, facing the dissolution of his army and the collapse of the Revolution, Washington began to formulate a plan so audacious that it bordered on madness. He would cross the Delaware on Christmas night and strike the enemy when they least expected it. The plan defied military convention and risked the complete destruction of the Continental Army. But Washington understood that desperate times demanded desperate measures, and that sometimes the greatest victories came from the darkest hours. Of apparent defeat, the plan crystallized in Washington's mind like ice forming on the Delaware's surface. As December 25th dawned gray and forbidding, the commander-in-chief summoned his most trusted officers to his headquarters tent. Colonel John Glover, whose Marblehead regiment had experience with boats, studied the crude map spread across Washington's field desk with growing concern. "General, the weather conditions are deteriorating rapidly," Glover warned, his Massachusetts accent thick with worry. "The river is choked with ice, and my men report the current running stronger than usual crossing in these conditions." He left the sentence unfinished, but his meaning was clear. Washington's piercing blue eyes fixed on each officer in turn. "Gentlemen, we face a choice that will determine not merely our fate, but the fate of this nascent nation. We can remain here, watch our army melt away with the new year, and surrender our dreams of liberty to British tyranny. Or we can seize destiny by the throat and strike a blow that will echo through the ages." Major James Wilkinson, serving as Deputy Adjutant General, voiced what many were thinking. "Sir, with respect, we risk losing everything. If we fail in this attack, the Continental Army ceases to exist. The revolution dies with us. Revolution is already dying, Washington replied with steel in his voice. Every day we delay gives our enemies more time to consolidate their positions, and our people more time to lose hope. We must act, and we must act now, while we still have an army to command. As documented by historian David Hackett Fisher in his acclaimed work, Washington's Crossing, the general's decision represented one of history's greatest military gambles. The plan required precise coordination between multiple columns crossing at different points. Attacking in the pre-dawn darkness against professional soldiers in fortified positions, the preparations began immediately. Washington divided his force into 3 columns. He would personally lead the main assault force of 2,400 men across at McConkey's Ferry, while General James Ewing would cross south of Trenton with 700 men, and Colonel John Cadwalader would lead 1,000 Pennsylvania militia across further south at Bristol. The synchronized attacks would prevent enemy escape and reinforcement. As darkness fell on Christmas night, snow began to fall in thick, wet flakes that clung to everything they touched. The temperature plummeted, turning the precipitation into sleet that stung exposed skin like needles. Colonel Glover's fishermen from Marblehead began the treacherous work of ferrying men, horses, and 18 pieces of artillery across the ice-choked Delaware. Captain Alexander Hamilton supervised the loading of his battery, watching nervously as the Durham boats wallowed dangerously low in the water under the weight of the heavy cannons. The young officer had joined Washington's military family just months earlier, but already he understood the magnitude of what they were attempting. One mistake, one overloaded boat breaking apart in the treacherous current, could doom the entire enterprise. Washington himself stood in the bow of the lead boat, his tall frame silhouetted against the snowy darkness. Behind him, men rowed with desperate determination. Knowing that their cause hung in the balance of this single night's work, the general's face remained impassive, but inwardly he wrestled with doubt. Had he condemned his army to destruction in pursuit of an impossible dream? The crossing took longer than planned. What should have been completed by midnight stretched past 3 in the morning as boats battled ice floes and howling winds. Yet somehow, miraculously, every man made it across alive. The successful crossing marked only the beginning of Washington's ordeal. His 2,400 men assembled on the Pennsylvania shore in the early hours of December 26, 1776. The full scope of the challenge ahead became brutally apparent. The 9-mile march to Trenton would have to be completed in conditions that tested the very limits of human endurance. General John Sullivan, commanding the right column of the attack force, approached Washington with disturbing news. "Sir, the men's powder is soaked through. This sleet is making our muskets unreliable at best, completely useless at worst." Sullivan's Irish features were grim with concern as he gestured toward his soldiers, who were desperately trying to keep their weapons dry under their coats. Washington's response became legend among those who heard it. "Tell General Sullivan, to use the bayonet, I am resolved to take Trenton." The march began at 4 in the morning, with 2 columns advancing along parallel roads toward their objective. Washington accompanied General Nathaniel Greene's division on the Pennington Road, while Sullivan's men took the river road. The storm intensified with each passing hour, transforming the simple march into an epic struggle against nature itself. Captain Thomas Forrest, commanding a battery of Pennsylvania artillery, later recalled the nightmare journey. The road became a river of mud and ice. Horses fell repeatedly, and we had to manhandle the cannons through snowdrifts that reached our waists. Men collapsed from exhaustion, but somehow found the strength to continue when their comrades helped them to their feet. Private John Greenwood of Peterborough, New Hampshire, marched barefoot through the frozen landscape, leaving bloody footprints that marked the army's passage. Years later, he would write, "I remember thinking that this must be what hell would look like if it froze over. Yet we pressed on, driven by something greater than ourselves, something that made us forget our pain and fear." The weather proved to be both curse and blessing. While it made the march a torment, it also provided perfect concealment for the American advance. Hessian sentries huddled in their guard posts, more concerned with staying warm than watching. For enemies they believed incapable of operating in such conditions. The storm that punished Washington's men also blinded their enemies to the approaching danger. By 7 in the morning, both American columns had reached the outskirts of Trenton without detection. Washington positioned himself where he could observe both roads, his headquarters flag barely visible through the swirling snow. Despite the hellish march, his army remained intact and ready for battle. The general's gamble had succeeded beyond his wildest hopes. They had achieved complete tactical surprise. Captain Alexander Hamilton unlimbered his guns at the head of King Street, the main thoroughfare leading into Trenton's heart. His cannons, which had seemed so burdensome during the river crossing and nightmare march, now represented the key to victory. Hamilton's battery would seal off the enemy's escape routes while the infantry swept through the town. Lieutenant Colonel Johann Raoul, the Hessian commander, lay sleeping off the effects of Christmas celebrations, completely unaware that his worst nightmare was materializing outside his headquarters. His professional soldiers, veterans of European warfare, had never faced an enemy desperate enough to attack in such impossible conditions. Washington drew his sword and raised, high above his head. Round him, officers and sergeants prepared to give the signal that would launch one of the most audacious attacks in military history. The moment of truth had arrived. Everything they had endured, every sacrifice they had made, every dream they had cherished, would be decided in the next few hours. At exactly 8 o'clock on the morning of December 26, 1776, the quiet streets of Trenton erupted in chaos as Washington's surprise attack began. Captain Alexander Hamilton's artillery battery unleashed the first salvo, sending cannonballs crashing into the Hessian positions at the head of King and Queen Streets. The thunderous roar of the guns echoed off the buildings like divine judgment, shattering the winter morning's stillness. Forward, march. Forward for liberty. The cry went up from 1,000 American throats as Continental soldiers poured into Trenton from both ends of the town. The Hessians, caught completely off guard, stumbled from their quarters in various states of undress, grabbing weapons and trying to form defensive lines in the face of the overwhelming assault. Lieutenant Colonel Johann Raoul burst from his headquarters. Still in his nightclothes, desperately trying to organize a coherent defense, the professional soldier who had dismissed the Americans as harmless rebels now faced the terrible reality of his miscalculation. Form ranks. He shouted in German, but his commands were lost in the din of battle and the confusion of men who had been awakened by cannon fire. General Nathaniel Greene's column swept down the Pennington Road like an avalanche, while General John Sullivan's men advanced along the river road, creating a perfect pincer movement that trapped the Hessians in the town center. The Americans moved with the desperate energy of men who knew this might be their last chance for victory, their bayonets gleaming despite the overcast sky. Private John Greenwood, who had marched barefoot through the snow just hours earlier, found himself in the thick of the fighting. The Hessians were brave soldiers, he later recalled, but they had been caught sleeping. And brave soldiers can do little when surprised by determined enemies who have nothing left to lose. Captain Washington's artillery, positioned at crucial street intersections, turned Trenton's thoroughfares into killing fields. The heavy guns commanded every avenue of escape, forcing the Hessians back into an ever-tightening circle. Hamilton's battery, in particular, dominated King Street, preventing any organized retreat toward Princeton. According to historian William Stryker's definitive account in the battles of Trenton and Princeton, the fighting reached its climax when Colonel Raoul attempted to lead a countercharge with his remaining men. Alcyon commander, mounted on his horse and sword raised high, presented a figure of desperate courage as he rallied his troops for one final push against the American lines. But courage alone could not overcome the tactical disaster that had befallen the Hessian garrison. Raoul himself fell mortally wounded when American musket balls found their mark. And with their commander down, organized resistance began to collapse. Groups of Hessians threw down their weapons and raised their hands in surrender, while others attempted to flee across Assunpink Creek only to find their escape routes blocked by Sullivan's men. The battle lasted less than 2 hours. Would resonate for centuries. When the smoke cleared and the last shots faded into echo, Washington's army had achieved the impossible. They had captured nearly 1,000 prisoners, including 30 officers, while suffering fewer than 10 casualties. More importantly, they had seized desperately needed supplies: muskets, ammunition, cannons, and provisions that would sustain the Continental Army through the coming campaign. General Washington moved through the captured town, his presence electrifying the victorious Americans. Soldiers who had been on the verge of desertion just days earlier now cheered their commander with voices hoarse from battle cries. The same men who had left bloody footprints in the snow during their midnight march now stood tall with renewed pride and purpose. As prisoners were secured and supplies cataloged, Washington faced a crucial decision. His original plan called for a swift return across the Delaware, but the stunning success at Trenton presented new opportunities and new dangers. British forces at Princeton and New Brunswick would soon learn of the defeat and march to recapture. The town news of the American victory at Trenton spread across the colonies like wildfire, transforming the psychological landscape of the Revolution in ways that Washington could never have anticipated. In Philadelphia, members of the Continental Congress, who had fled the city in panic just weeks earlier, began filtering back, their confidence restored by reports of the stunning triumph. Printer shops worked overtime producing broadsides announcing the victory, and tavern patrons raised toasts to the hero of Trenton. But Washington understood that one victory, however dramatic, would not win the war. As his army rested in the captured town, the general wrestled with a decision that would determine whether Trenton represented a temporary reprieve or the beginning of a genuine resurgence. Intelligence reports indicated that General Charles Cornwallis was marching south from New York with 8,000 British regulars, determined to crush the upstart Americans and recapture the initiative. "We have awakened a sleeping giant," observed General Nathanael Greene as he studied maps in Rawle's former headquarters. "Cornwallis will not make the same mistakes as the Hessians. He will come at us with overwhelming force and professional competence." Washington nodded grimly, understanding the truth in Greene's assessment. The British response would be swift and merciless. Yet something had changed in the American camp since the victory. Soldiers who had been ready to abandon the cause now spoke eagerly of continuing the fight. Enlistments that should have expired on December 31st were being extended as men, caught up in the euphoria of victory, volunteered to serve longer. Captain Alexander Hamilton, his uniform still stained with gunpowder from the battle, brought disturbing intelligence to the command meeting. "Sir, our scouts report that General Cadwalader's Pennsylvania militia failed to cross the Delaware as planned. They turned back due to ice conditions. We remain isolated on this side of the river with limited support," the young artillery officer's report highlighted the precarious nature of Washington's position. While the victory at Trenton had been complete, the larger strategic situation remained dangerous. The Continental Army was still outnumbered, still poorly supplied, and still operating in enemy territory with their backs to a frozen river, as documented in John Buchanan's The Road to Valley Forge. Washington faced pressure from multiple directions following the Trenton victory. Political leaders urged him to consolidate gains and avoid unnecessary risks, while his own officers debated whether to retreat across the Delaware or advance deeper into New Jersey. The decision would ultimately rest with the commander-in-chief. Alone, on December 30th, Washington made his choice. Rather than retreat to the safety of Pennsylvania, he would advance toward Princeton, seeking to capitalize on the momentum gained at Trenton, while British forces were still reeling from the shock of defeat. It was another enormous gamble. The general had learned that sometimes the most audacious moves produce the greatest results. The march toward Princeton began on January 1st, 1777, with Washington's army now reinforced by fresh militia units inspired by news of the Trenton victory. General Hugh Mercer's brigade took the lead, with orders to secure the vital crossroads at Princeton and prevent British reinforcements from reaching Cornwallis, who was advancing from the north with his main force, Private Joseph White of Connecticut. Later recalled the atmosphere during the advance. The men marched with a spring in their step that had been absent for months. We had proven that the British and their allies could be beaten, and that knowledge changed everything. We were no longer running away. We were advancing toward our destiny. The weather had cleared since the Christmas storm, and the January sun cast long shadows across the snow-covered New Jersey countryside. Church bells in distant villages rang in celebration of the new year and the unexpected American victory, their chimes carrying across the frozen landscape like a promise of better days ahead. Washington rode at the head of his column, his blue uniform and white horse making him unmistakable to friends and enemies alike. The general, who had crossed the Delaware in desperate hope, now led his men forward with justified confidence. Knowing that the Revolution had found new life in the crucible of winter warfare, the morning of January 3rd, 1770, dawned crisp and clear as Washington's army approached the outskirts of Princeton, New Jersey. General Hugh Mercer's advance brigade moved cautiously through the frost-covered countryside, their breath visible in the cold air as they neared the prestigious college town that housed one of America's finest institutions of learning. Unknown to the Americans, British forces under Lieutenant Colonel Charles Mulhood were simultaneously marching out of Princeton toward Trenton, setting the stage for an unexpected collision that would determine the fate of Washington's bold offensive. The two forces met near the William Clark Farm, approximately 2 miles southwest of Princeton proper. Mercer's men were advancing through an orchard when British light infantry suddenly appeared on their flank, muskets already leveled for action. The veteran general, a Scottish physician who had served with Washington since the French and Indian War, immediately recognized the danger and began deploying his troops for battle. Form line, Mercer shouted, his sword flashing in the morning sunlight as he positioned his men behind a rail fence that offered some protection from the British advance. The Americans, many still flush with confidence from their victory at Trenton, moved with practiced efficiency despite the surprise encounter. Lieutenant Colonel Mulhood, commanding the British 17th Foot Regiment, assessed the situation quickly and ordered an immediate bayonet charge. His professional soldiers, their red coats vivid against the white snow, advanced with the disciplined precision that had made British infantry feared across 2 continents. The clash, when it came, would determine whether Washington's Princeton gamble succeeded or failed catastrophically. The initial British charge struck Mercer's line like a thunderbolt. American militiamen, many fighting in their first major engagement, wavered under the assault of seasoned regulars who attacked with cold professional competence. General Mercer himself fell wounded, bayoneted multiple times while trying to rally his men. His brigade began to crumble under the relentless British pressure. Captain Alexander Hamilton, accompanying Washington with the artillery reserve, watched in horror as Mercer's retreat threatened to become a complete rout. "Sir, if we don't intervene immediately, Mulhood will roll up our entire left flank," Hamilton warned, his young voice tight with urgency. Washington spurred his horse forward, riding directly toward the wavering American line with a courage that bordered on recklessness. Behind him came Captain Hamilton's battery and several companies of Continental regulars, their presence immediately felt on the confused battlefield. The general's appearance among his retreating soldiers had an electric effect. Men who had been running suddenly stopped, turned, and began forming new defensive positions. "Stand fast, my brave fellows," Washington called out, his voice carrying clearly across the battlefield despite the noise of combat. "Show them what American soldiers can do." The sight of their commander exposing himself to enemy fire while rallying the troops inspired even the most frightened militiamen to stand their ground. As recorded in Alfred Hoyt bills the campaign of Princeton, Washington's personal intervention, at this critical moment represented one of the most decisive acts of battlefield leadership in American military history. The general positioned himself between his own troops and the advancing British, becoming a target for enemy marksmen while reorganizing his scattered forces. Captain Hamilton unlimbered his guns and opened fire on the British line. Gunnery disrupting Mulhood's advance just as it seemed on the verge of breaking through completely. The young artillery officer had learned his craft well during the siege of Boston, and now his skills served the cause of independence at its moment of greatest need. The tide of battle began to turn as Washington's personal example inspired his. men to fight with renewed determination. Fresh Continental troops, arriving from the main army, extended the American line and began flanking the British position. Mahood, recognizing that his isolated regiment faced encirclement, ordered a fighting withdrawal toward Princeton proper. The British retreat soon became a rout as American forces, their confidence restored by Washington's leadership, pressed their advantage with growing enthusiasm. Red-coated soldiers who had advanced with such confidence just hours earlier now fled across the frozen fields, abandoning equipment and wounded comrades in their haste to escape the American pursuit. The pursuit of Mahood's shattered forces carried the Continental Army into Princeton itself, where the final acts of this remarkable drama unfolded against the backdrop of Nassau Hall, the college's main building that had been converted into a British stronghold. Captain Alexander Hamilton's artillery battery wheeled into position facing the imposing stone structure, while American infantry surrounded the building to prevent any escape attempts. Inside Nassau Hall, approximately 200 British soldiers and Loyalist militiamen had barricaded themselves, hoping to make a last stand until reinforcements could arrive from New Brunswick. The irony was not lost on the attacking Americans. They were besieging a temple of learning that had educated many of the Revolution's leaders, including several signers of the Declaration of Independence. Hamilton's cannons spoke with authority, sending solid shot crashing into the hall's walls and shattering windows and cascades of broken glass. One cannonball allegedly passed through a portrait of King George II, symbolically decapitating the monarch in a scene that would be remembered for generations. The bombardment, though brief, convinced the defenders that further resistance was futile. White flags appeared at the building's windows, and British officers emerged to negotiate surrender terms. General Washington, still mounted on his white charger and his uniform stained with battle smoke, accepted the capitulation with the dignity befitting a victorious commander. The revolution that had seemed moribund just 2 weeks earlier now witnessed its enemies surrendering in one of America's most revered seats of learning. The psychological impact of the Princeton victory proved even more significant than the tactical success. News of Washington's second triumph in 10 days electrified colonial opinion and shattered British assumptions about American military capabilities. In London, King George III received reports of the defeats with growing alarm, while in Paris, French officials began reconsidering their assessment of American prospects for independence. Private Joseph White, who had marched through the hell of the Delaware crossing and the nightmare approach to Trenton, reflected on the transformation he witnessed. 10 days ago, we were beaten men ready to abandon our cause. Today we stand victorious in Princeton. Having proven that American soldiers can defeat the finest troops in the world, the revolution that was dying has been reborn in fire and snow. Washington established his headquarters in Princeton, using the respite to reorganize his army and consolidate the strategic gains achieved through 2 stunning victories. Enlistments that should have expired on December 31st were extended, as men caught up in the euphoria of success volunteered to continue serving. Fresh recruits arrived daily, inspired by news of American triumphs to join the cause of independence. The British response came swiftly but too late to reverse the strategic situation. General Cornwallis, who had been pursuing Washington with 8,000 men, found himself chasing shadows as the American commander withdrew his forces to winter quarters in Morristown, New Jersey. The British general, who had dismissed the Continental Army as a fleeing enemy, now faced the sobering reality that Washington's force remained intact and dangerous. European observers took notice of the American resurgence with growing interest. Frederick the Great of Prussia reportedly declared that Washington's Trenton-Princeton campaign ranked among the finest military achievements of the age, comparing it favorably to the greatest victories of Alexander and Caesar. French Foreign Minister Vergennes accelerated secret negotiations with American representatives, sensing that the rebels might actually achieve their independence with proper support. As winter settled over the Continental Army's Morristown encampment, soldiers gathered around campfires to share stories of their incredible journey from despair to triumph. They had crossed an ice-choked river on Christmas night, marched through a blizzard that would have stopped professional armies, and defeated seasoned European troops in 2 separate engagements. Most importantly, they had restored hope to a cause that had seemed lost beyond redemption. Washington himself, writing to his brother Samuel, captured the essence of what had been accomplished. The game is pretty near up, owing, in a great measure, to the insidious arts of the enemy and disaffection of the colonies. But virtue and fortitude will, I trust, yet save us. The victories at Trenton and Princeton had proven that. Yes. Virtue and fortitude could indeed triumph over seemingly impossible odds. The revolution that had flickered like a dying candle in December 1776 now burned with renewed intensity. Washington's crossing of the Delaware and the battles that followed had given America something precious beyond measure, the knowledge that independence was not just a dream, but an achievable goal worth any sacrifice. From that frozen Christmas night to the final victory at Yorktown, the flame kindled at Trenton and Princeton would never be extinguished.